Hi everyone, this is John AI motherfucking Frusciante. Today you'll be able to hear the guitar player interview I gave back in 2022.
Since your return to the Red Hot Chili Peppers, the band has written and recorded close to 50 songs and released 2 albums. That's a significant amount of studio work. But you also returned to the stage with the band. How has it been to perform with Anthony, Flea, and Chad again?
It's a real different experience just because of the size of the stadiums. It pulls a lot out of you, especially because I came back into the band in a spirit of giving. I really wanted to play for people, but when we made the records, it was more about playing for the other guys in the band or playing something that I'd want to play for my friends. But going out on stage, there's times where I go up to the mic to sing and I make eye contact with people and I see 2 people that are clearly in love and really happy to be there, or a little kid who's really happy, or a young girl who's jumping up and down, or a group of guys that are jumping around in a circle because they're so happy that we played the particular song that they really like. Sometimes those moments I start crying, or I get choked up and I can't sing and I have to shut my eyes and stare down at the ground and collect myself.
That's intense.
There's a lot of emotional moments like that. And I don't know that in the band we've ever been so appreciative of being there with each other before, because we have this lifetime behind us of these meaningful moments playing together. It's very important to us. We all feel very supported by each other.
One very cool aspect of these shows is that you, Flea, and Chad begin the set with an instrumental improvisation. When you're dealing with audiences in venues of this size, the goal of a rock band is usually to hit the stage and blow the fans' hair back. But you guys approach the music in a more open and creative way.
Yeah, it's a good way to really get in touch with the particular energy that's there that night, because every crowd is different and every venue feels different, and we're also in a different mood every night. So by improvising right at the beginning, we get in touch with what the spirit of the moment is, and oftentimes that sets the tone for the rest of the show. And, throughout the show, there's lots of spontaneity. Every time there's a solo, whether it's a song that we don't play often or a song that we play every night, I feel really creative in those moments. Every second on the stage feels worthwhile.
Return of the Dream Canteen is culled from songs recorded during the same sessions as Unlimited Love. When you were in the studio, did you have an idea of which songs would ultimately wind up on which record?
I definitely gave it a lot of thought, but it really came down to what order we decided to mix the songs in. I had my own personal idea of what would make a good second album and what would make a good first one, but I didn't feel so strongly about it that I took the trouble to go to the band and say, look guys, before we mix anything, let's make this decision right here and now. I planned on doing that, but I just never did. It seemed like the way it went was sometimes Anthony would suggest mixing a particular song, sometimes I would, sometimes maybe Flea would, and we just kind of trusted that whatever was going to be was going to be. There really was no conscious idea about what the difference between the 2 albums should be. That said, there were certain songs that I felt should wait for the second album. Like Eddie, I really wanted to put that one on the second album because I felt like it might be kind of a crowd pleaser. And we didn't want the first album to be all the best stuff and the second one to be the leftovers. So there were certain songs that, even though other people wanted to mix them, I said, let's save that one.
Now that the 2 records are out, do you notice certain defining characteristics of each one?
Before we started mixing Unlimited Love and Return of the Dream Canteen, the band had the basic idea that we would try to cover the essential bases with the first record, and the second record would be the more eccentric, adventurous one. But in several cases, we contradicted this by saving certain staples for record 2 and putting some of the more unexpected things on record 1. We decided in advance what the first and last song would be on each record, but the rest we figured out as we went along. As it turned out, I hear Return of the Dream Canteen as a more fun record, and I think it goes to further extremes. This one has a more colorful, kind of bright thing to it. Not that it doesn't have dark sections, but to me, Unlimited Love seems darker. The new one also maybe has more surprising elements. There's a little bit of that on the first album, too. But especially on the second half of this one, there's probably more synthesizers and drum machines and stuff like that than people might expect from us. And it also feels more off the cuff and spontaneous. There's a certain feeling of relaxedness and looseness that distinguishes Return of the Dream Canteen from Unlimited Love.
You mentioned the Return of the Dream Canteen song, Eddie, which is clearly a tribute to Eddie Van Halen, especially in regard to Anthony's lyrics. While the music doesn't much reflect the Van Halen sound, you incorporated some overt EVH flourishes into your solo, such as tapping, whammy bar work, unique phrasings. What was your intention going into that one?
When we're in the studio in between takes, I'm always doing things like two-handed tapping. The engineers hear it all the time. I'll play really flashy stuff during breaks, but when it comes to recording, I'm doing what I think is right for the song. And in most cases, that doesn't involve playing really flashy. But it is something I enjoy. Still, doing that solo was a mindfuck, I'll tell you that. And it was the last solo that I did out of all the solos on the 48 songs we recorded. I saved it for last because the idea of having a song about Eddie Van Halen, you're basically saying to people, think about Eddie Van Halen. And then when it comes to this long guitar solo at the end, you're going, now watch this. And I did not like that idea. I was even thinking of cutting the solo entirely because I did not know how to go about it. I was trying for a while and I wasn't happy with anything I was doing. I was either going too far in the Eddie Van Halen direction to where it was too busy and there was too much two-handed tapping and it didn't sound like me, or I was just doing it and it only sounded like me in a song about Eddie Van Halen.
How did you find a happy medium?
I just turned my mind off and stopped thinking about it. I stopped being self-conscious about the idea that the song was about Eddie Van Halen and just did what was natural. We were recording, and I took maybe a 15-minute break, and when I came back in, I just did the whole thing, like I said, in one take. Whatever Eddie Van Halen is in there, it's just there because of my love for him and the love that I felt for his playing since I was 8 years old. Things like the fast tapping and accentuating different notes with the vibrato bar, he did that a lot. And then there are also the parts of his style that don't involve playing fast that are just really exciting to me. Playing in a way that feels spontaneous, or when you hear feedback because he recorded his parts in the same room as his amplifier. To this day, those things give me chills, like this is real, what's happening here. This isn't some guy standing in the control room punching in. This is a guy going out on a limb and taking risks. Throughout both of these albums, I tried to do a lot of that.
As far as the hallmarks of your style, one thing that has always stuck out to me is your use of space. You hear it on songs like Eddie and Shoot Me a Smile on the new album, and also in some of the band's classic tracks like Scar Tissue as well as Californication. Another obvious one would be Other Side, where for much of the rhythm track, you're playing maybe 2 or 3 notes. Where does that approach come from?
It really comes from trying to figure out what I can do that makes Flea and Chad sound as good as they can. Back in the time of Mother's Milk, I was trying to fill up more space, and it just sounded too busy. It wasn't as busy as Flea, but Flea has a way of being busy on the bass that never sounds too busy. It always sounds like he's doing what he's doing in support of the song. I felt after making that record that I wasn't supporting the songs and my bandmates as well as I could have.
That began to change on the follow-up, Blood Sugar Sex Magic.
Another thing there was that Rick Rubin, when he started producing us at the Blood Sugar time, he kept adding ideas to the arrangements, like have no guitar for the first verse or have no bass for the second verse. He came from this hip-hop experience, so he was essentially muting the instruments in certain sections. That was inspiring for me because I was already going in the direction of playing less and seeing how much better that made the band sound as a whole. So I just got to a point where I really saw the musical value of space of all types, whether it's the distance between one point in the bar line and another point in the bar line, or the distance between two sounds in terms of using wide intervals or creating a chord out of me playing one note on my guitar and Flea playing one note on his bass. It just seemed to make the band feel more whole. And to be honest, the other guys liked it when I started playing that way, and I felt supported.
You also employ intervals, and particularly wide intervals, in a very unique way.
I think a lot of people play guitar a certain way, and it may be because they're just playing with bass players who play simple root note bass lines. But because Flea plays in such an interesting way, I think of intervals not only as the relationship between two notes on my instrument, but as the relationship between what I'm doing and what he's doing. Take something like the intro to By the Way or the verses of Other Side. I'm not thinking of my guitar as the center of it. I'm thinking of my guitar as a portion of it. I'm thinking of the pitch of Flea's bass line and the pitch of my guitar. If Flea's playing a note and I'm playing a note, we've got a 2-note chord right there. And the interval is the space between that. So then it's like, how can I move in a way that's different from how he's moving? If he goes down, maybe I go up. And we start creating different little harmony things where we imply chords without either of us playing the whole chord, that kind of thing. Or there's things like scar tissue where I'm doing those wide 2-note intervals on my own, but I'm really thinking of it as 2 separate parts.
Sonically, your use of space is complemented by the fact that you're incredibly comfortable incorporating fully clean tones into your rhythm and lead work.
For me, it's really about being punchy. That's more important than distortion. Distorted guitar often sounds pretty wimpy to me. Even if the person's got a rich, thick tone, if the way they're hitting the instrument isn't exciting and punchy, it doesn't do anything for me.
What inspired your attraction to clean tones?
A lot of the basis for my guitar playing stylistically is in music that I loved when I was a kid that I've always continued to love. There's a lot of post-punk stuff, or what we now call post-punk stuff. Back then we called it new wave, but it's guys like Ricky Wilson from the B-52s and Matthew Ashman from Bow Wow Wow. Bands like The Cure and Scritti Politti and the Minutemen. The pop group is a really weird one, but I think they were some real originators, and the guitar playing is really good. All these people and bands did really powerful things with clean tones. You listen to D. Boon's playing in the Minutemen, and you really hear what I'm talking about. He'll rip into a solo, and the tone is clean as can be. But it's got more power than a heavy metal guitar player, just because he cares so much and he's putting so much soul and feeling into the thing. And Ricky Wilson, the first show I ever saw that was in a big place like a 5000 seater, was the B-52S. This was in 83. And his guitar playing was just incredible. Like, it made people happy. And I'm really about the emotional response. For me, it's more about reaching people than it is about wanting to say, look at how big and tough and macho I am.
All that said, you can also conjure some truly thick and gnarly tones when the song calls for it. The chords you're playing in the chorus of Reach Out on the new album would be a good example. Or, solo-wise, the fuzz and feedback frenzy in the heavy wing on Unlimited Love. How did you achieve those sounds?
A lot of times it's from using more than one distortion pedal at a time. I generally have a Boss distortion pedal on the yellow OD3 overdrive or the orange DS, one distortion one, and also an Electro Harmonics Big Muff or that brown MXR distortion pedal, the super badass Variac fuzz. It seemed like I used those a lot on the records. I can't remember specifically what pedals I used where, but I'd say a lot of the time I'm combining different distortions and fuzz tones. So it's that, and then it's also having the Marshalls really loud and being in the same room with them. Because even when you're not getting feedback, when you're right there in front of a loud amp, there is a form of feedback going on that contributes to the sense of the sound being kind of super blown out. I think the fact that almost all the distorted solos were done with me in the same room as the amp contributes to the tone in its own way.
Even with all of this focus on technique and sound and gear, the crux of your guitar playing is in the emotional content. How do you manage to play from your heart rather than your brain?
Oh God, that's a good question and a hard one to answer. I feel like all that conflict took place in me between the ages of 14 and 18, and after that I learned the lesson, and luckily my brain was developing while I was learning that lesson. But during those years when I was learning it, I had all kinds of conflicts. But once I got to the point where I felt I could pretty much play whatever I wanted to learn, it was a very exciting period for me. But there was also that question in my mind of, what is it that I have to say? Because I was so in love with all these different people who made vastly different types of music and guitar players who were also so different from one another. And it seemed to me that each one had their own little place in saying something that was different than what the other one was saying. Even people who were kind of similar, like Randy Rhoads and Eddie Van Halen, to me they were saying completely different things. And so when I was a teenager, I would wonder about those things like, what is it that I have to say that's different from anybody else?
How did learning theory play into that?
My understanding of theory was a way for me to be able to analyze the things that I liked. So if I was playing along with, say, the guitar solo in Something by the Beatles, and there's certain notes that George Harrison plays that make me go, wow, what the hell was he thinking? Why did he go from that note to that note? Why does it feel so good when he does it? I'm able to look at those notes in relationship to the chords and the intervals and so on and figure it out. So for me, the purpose of knowing the theory is to have an understanding of why I'm feeling a particular emotion.
It's interesting that you utilize theory as a means of tapping into your emotions. It's sort of the opposite of how many people think about it, which is that a reliance on theory can result in a clinical and cold approach to the instrument?
Well, I think a lot of the time people want to sound confident on their instrument, but to me, vulnerability is one of the most endearing things to hear in a piece of music. And I realized it felt like I was giving more of myself if I was vulnerable on the instrument. That ties into using the clean tones, to doing things that are understated, all these things. And I think that's universal. As much as we admire confidence in people, we all know deep down that vulnerability is one of the hardest things to achieve. And any little degree that you can allow yourself to be more vulnerable with your friends or with your partner or with your playing, it's one of the strongest things you can do.
I would say that's a through line in most of the guitarists you cited as influences in your youth.
As far as me having those thoughts when I was a kid about what do I have to say to people with my guitar playing, I feel like a lot of what I've wound up having to say has to do with vulnerability. It has to do with being supportive of other people and also putting yourself out there in a way that's scary sometimes. It's that thing where it feels like your heart's too much out there and people could stomp on it, but also that you're okay with that, you know?